Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video, and in this video I'll be reviewing the latest season of Big Brother US BB23, which has ended up being a massive mixed bag of a season. I mean, it's a season that started off with so much promise, largely due to how amazing this cast was, both with how likable the majority of them were, but also how hard a lot of them were playing. And really, that did last for about half of the season, but the back half of the season ends up being more of a steamroll that just became overly frustrating to watch, with most of the players there not playing in their best interest, and openly so. But really, this season is going to be more notable for the story of the Cookout, one of the most dominant alliances in the history of the show, and producing the game's first ever black winner, which is a strong story in its own right. And again, I do fully support their cause, but that doesn't mean it didn't lead to a bevy of frustrations over how the game was being played that do end up harming my overall opinion on the season. But like all my other season reviews, I will be running through season from beginning to end, and we have a lot to talk about. So let's start off with week 1, where you get another live move-in, and I think they handled it a lot better this time than they did last season. I mean, it's still not ideal, as we don't get to see any of the initial dynamics on this premiere episode, and it mostly just comprises of player intros and live competitions without any real DRs, which makes the comps even more boring than they already are. But I do think this premiere was handled as well as it could have been, considering the format. Just like last season, we are introduced to the players 4 at a time, and we get a competition between them where the winner ends up playing for HOH. Again, kind of bloating this episode with competitions, but I did find it interesting that they had these pre-recorded DRs to play while the players were moving in, which was a nice touch. But we do end up with Frenchie, Whitney, Christian, and Claire. Ironically, none of the people in the dominant alliance of the season end up winning here. And we find out that they are going to be team captains and get to pick the teams. And with that, we might as well talk about the team twist, which didn't work too dissimilarly to how teams worked in BB11 or BB18. But I do feel like the teams on this season did boon the season as a whole. In most seasons, these teams end up being pretty arbitrary, but on this season, the teams definitely played an impact on how the players were perceiving the game, especially for the first half of it, where it seemed like the players actually looked at these groups as built-in alliances and seemed to be a major factor in how some alliances were getting put together. But we then get the true HOH comp that involves putting together a puzzle on a platform that is held by your team, and Christian almost wins this comp, but his team ends up dropping the puzzle at the last second. Then after that, they were just fighting to not come in last and not become have-nots, but his team ends up dropping the puzzle again, so they do come in last. And I did feel bad for Christian here, where, and there was a point where he was potentially going to be the first boot, despite, for all intents and purposes, like winning this comp. But Frenchie ends up winning the comp instead here, and really thank God, because he did make for such great TV and such chaotic gameplay during the first week here. But we do end the premiere with Frenchie getting a dilemma where Frenchie can play in another comp to go double or nothing for safety for the next week as well, but he decides not to play, which I do think was the correct move, which I'll very rarely be saying about Frenchie. But what I do find hilarious here is that they still forced him to play the comp anyway, just to waste time in the episode. Now, a final thing about the premiere here is that we do get the announcement that they're increasing the prize money from $500,000 to $750,000, which is like, why not just go for $1 million? That just felt so weird to me. But as for the rest of the week, we do get a pretty insane first week of feeds, probably the most insane first week of Big Brother possibly ever, and almost all of that is due to Frenchie and how bombastic of a player he is. Frenchie is this person that came into the game preaching about how he wasn't going to allow the easy targets to go home early. He talked about targeting the alpha guys, and to go along with that, he does end up gathering all the women, declaring to them that they will be safe for the entire week. And he does the same thing to the people of color as well. But he does also make a deal with his move-in group as well that does include Travis, so he's kind of safe. So that narrows down the field here to really only Brent and Christian as the possible nominees, with Brent being the initial target. Now, I know Brent is looked at as a joke and for sure is one of the worst players on this cast, but he actually does some really impressive work here early on, where he does talk to Frenchie. He bonds with him over being stereotyped and about losing his father, and all of a sudden he's now Frenchie's right hand man. Very impressed by Brent at the very beginning. Too bad he doesn't keep that up. But now Brent's safe, Frenchie has his eyes on Christian as the target. This is when we get the wildcard comp, this season's new early game comp that we see different variations of throughout the years. And while I do think it worked out well this week, I don't particularly like this twist. I mean, to me, the safety suite from last season was a pretty perfect twist in this spot. But the fact that with the wildcard comp here, the power that's associated with it changes every week, that was something I didn't particularly care for, especially when some of them were just straight up bad. But here we see Christian winning this pretty unique comp of having to navigate around a hotel room to find objects in the fastest time, but you get a time penalty for making loud noises, and I did find that to be an interesting comp. But Christian ends up winning here, and the dilemma here wasn't really even a dilemma, where he essentially just gets to spin a wheel and the number that comes up correlates to how many teammates he can make safe. And I didn't get why this dilemma wasn't there every week, instead of these other ones that just didn't make sense to actually do, things like switching teams or randomly giving other players immunity, which again, I feel like those were rarely ever going to be used. But now with Christian being safe, this leaves Frenchie with literally no one that he hasn't given some level of research to. And this is where he really goes off on being the showmance killer. And despite them not being in a showmance at this point, he does just assume that Christian and Alyssa are in one and makes her the target because of that, while also using Kyland as a pawn, which really just comes out of nowhere. But through this, he instantly breaks 2 deals he had made. Again, he said he wouldn't put a woman up. Yeah, he puts up Alyssa. He says he wouldn't put up a person of color. Yeah, he puts up Kyland. And to go along with this, he also gives this ridiculous speech about dreaming about fishing and needing the perfect bait. And while I know a lot of people were really upset by these sequence of events, to me it just shows how much of a train wreck this first week was. To me, it really just shows how much of a train wreck Frenchie was as a player and as a character. And what makes this even funnier is that immediately after the nomination ceremony, Alyssa and Christian go to Frenchie, where they're able to convince him almost immediately that he was wrong, and now he wants to target Derek X. And the show tries to make it seem like, oh, Derek X is the target because Frenchie heard him and Travis talking about how bad Frenchie is. But in reality, I mean, Derek X was ready to target at that point for, again, seemingly minuscule reasons. But Brent does want to save Derek X, and we get this conversation between the two that was really our first indication of Brent being really condescending, which obviously a major storyline later in the season. But we then get to the veto comp where Frenchie gets the worst possible draw here, where both of his backup targets in Derek X and Travis end up playing, and Derek X does end up winning with a pretty savvy strategy of working on the bottom of the board only to copy everyone else's strategy at the top, which was fun to see. But once again, this really messes with Frenchie's plans, and now really forcing Frenchie to break his word once again, this time with Travis, who he promised safety to on day 1, who he ends up putting up after Derek X uses the veto on Kyland, which I did think was a pretty bad move on his end. I mean, while Derek X had a great relationship with Kyland, he also had a really good one with Travis, and by him using the veto here, he essentially seals Travis's fate, while if he had not used the veto, he could have fought for Kyland to stay and keep both of his allies in. But again, once Travis was on the block, he was clearly going home, and he ended up not campaigning until the last second either. And even when he did campaign, it was very ineffective, largely using pretty much just saying things that people already knew. He wasn't bringing anything new to the table that would make them change their minds. But outside of the events that led to the eviction, there's a lot of other things that went on this week. I mean, with Frenchie, he was just all over the place. He made deals with Tiffany, Brent, Whitney, and Xavier early on. He made the Slaughterhouse, the initial majority alliance that he told almost everybody the concept of, to where everyone in the house knew that he wanted to make an alliance called the Slaughterhouse, but only 8 were actually in the alliance itself. I mean, the core of that being the Butchers, a grouping between him, Xavier, Kyland, Big D, and Christian, which was made before Kyland was put on the block, which makes his nomination even more insane. But they add in Brent, Alyssa, and Whitney to create the Slaughterhouse, which Frenchie describes as an alliance of all of his biggest threats. And he talks in DR about how he doesn't even trust most of the people there, which is obviously a great foundation to your majority alliance. He also leads the charge in creating an all-girls alliance called French Kisses, which was obviously a complete joke. And while theoretically he is now aligned with all sides of the house, it was just so transparent that this is what he was doing, and so many people saw through this. But this week is also where we see the creation of the Cookout, the alliance that does end up dominating the season, an alliance that didn't even really start as a formal alliance. It was more so an agreement amongst all the black players in the house to watch each other's backs and guarantee that there will be a black winner. But to do so without ever formally getting all the members together to throw off suspicion, which was an interesting element of this group's strategy. And while after its initial grouping I did think that there was a lot of potential for it moving forward, I never would have expected them to be as dominant of an alliance as they ended up being. But as for the eviction itself, again, it is pretty clear that Travis was going home here, and let's just talk about him, who, again, Travis was there. Probably one of the least notable members, and if not the least notable member, of this really strong cast. I mean, Travis is the type of person that you would think would do well on most older seasons of Big Brother, and one that would be grouped into the majority alliance. But with this cast, he was definitely an outlier here, and I do feel like he just felt way too passive in the game, not having any real alliances, and even his closest relationships, like his one with DX, didn't even end up fighting for him to stay. So I do think Travis played this season all wrong, despite him being extremely unlucky to be taken out here to begin with, where he was like Frenchie's 5th or 6th target. So I do think a lot of luck played into him getting taken out so early, but he also didn't really do much to begin with. But with that, let's move on to week 2, where I did like the HOH comp, which was a bit of a crapshoot, but I did add a level of strategy to it by having the players have to pick a starting position, the one to land the shot from the furthest position ends up winning, and we do have Kyland winning HOH here, which did set us up for another pretty crazy week that did lead to the downfall of Frenchie, as you would expect. But the crazy thing here is that Frenchie actually came into this round in a decent position. I mean, yeah, everyone caught on to his game, and no one was really planning on taking him deep into the game, but pretty much no one was actually targeting him this week, with the majority of the house actually targeting Brent here instead. But Frenchie really loses his mind this week. Now, I do think he got somewhat unlucky that Kyland won HOH, with Kyland being one of the few people that could have potentially targeted him. But Frenchie really let his paranoia get the better of him, with him thinking that he was in danger the entire way, and him thinking that the slaughterhouse was in on it, to where he goes to Whitney in front of everyone and tells him that he's out, which was completely insane. And he does go to Brent and tell Brent to throw the wildcard comp to him, to which during that we see that even Brent is done with Frenchie. Now Beth ends up winning the wildcard comp here, which again gives her a dumb dilemma of having to switch teams with someone on the safe team in order to get immunity, which, considering her strong positioning at this point in the game, this move made no sense for her. Really would have just ruined her relationship with Tiffany or Claire, two people who she had a very good relationship at this point in the game. Now Kyland handles his HOH in an interesting way, where he literally does no game talk on night 1, but after a wildcard comp, he holds very quick one-on-ones with every player. And this ends up being the way that most HOHs are run from this point forward on this season. And it did lead to a fun sequence on the feeds where it was just non-stop game for most of that day, with him just pulling in people left and right. And with everyone throwing Frenchie on their bus, Kyland obviously had a very clear reason to put him up. And with a very clear consensus target, it does end up leading to Kyland playing this first HOH pretty well. Certainly better than his next one. Now the other nom is Brittany, and the show tries to show it as her nomination is a consequence of her not throwing Frenchie under the bus, but in reality, Brittany was always going to be the nom here. Actually, she was going to be the nom before Frenchie was going to be nominated, as she was the only person that Kyland literally had no relationship with. But we end up with Frenchie and Brittany as the nominations, and Frenchie does what you expect from him. He goes to Brittany and tells her that he's going to sacrifice his game for her. We have him revealing the slaughterhouse to people. He does threaten to quit at a point, and it really does show Frenchie in a much more positive light than he really deserved, really explaining his thought process while doing things that were just completely illogical. We do get this ridiculous veto comp where they have to catch this spray, or I'm pretty sure it was just water, and I just felt like an excuse to use slow-mo while showing these players falling. But Derek X wins the veto once again, pretty much sealing Frenchie's fate. And I love how Frenchie has this DR saying that, oh, if Dan can survive coming back from the dead, so can I. I mean, it's like, sure, I guess. But as for the other events of the week, we do have some people trying to figure out who the hinky votes were from the previous week, where one of them was Big D, who lies about his vote pretty spectacularly bad by saying that he didn't do it, but he's willing to take the blame for it, which is like, why are you saying that? We also get a flashback as well, which I feel like we get a decent amount of flashbacks on the season, which was cool to see. But we do see Frenchie recruiting Tiffany to throw a vote for him. And later on in the week, we do see Frenchie going around telling people that, oh, I know who the 2 votes were, which obviously irritates Tiffany and is more indicative of Frenchie's poor play during this week. But this also leads to Tiffany getting a lot of credit on the show for putting the target onto Frenchie, which I will give Tiffany a lot of credit for things moving forward, but I feel like this was largely inaccurate here, where Tiffany's target was actually Brent, and she actually had to settle for Frenchie. But Tiffany does end up doing really brilliant work this week in toppling Frenchie's power structure. Now, obviously, it's Frenchie, so his structure wasn't that strong to begin with, and he obviously did his own work to crumble his alliance, but Tiffany does a great job at picking up the pieces. Now, I do think this was also helped by Kyland winning HOH. I do think Kyland deserves part of the credit here, but Tiffany did a lot of the legwork, putting the targets onto Brent and Whitney moving forward, creating the royal flush, which ends up holding the power for next few rounds. She does create an alliance with Beth as well that keeps her insulated, all while also having the Cookout in her back pocket, really putting herself in a power position for the majority of the game. But Kyland also does a great job this week as well, being a part of a lot of Tiffany's plans moving forward, while also securing his safety through making deals with each of the teams, along with solidifying his bonds with people like Derek X, Beth, and creating a final 2 with Tiffany. But again, as for the vote itself, we do get a cringy eviction rap from Brittany, but Frenchie still does end up going home here, and has a very awkward interview with Julie where he's so high on himself for how much he's changed the game from previous seasons, despite him not causing much change at all. And now let's talk about Frenchie, who had such a notable downfall here, with him now setting the standard on what not to do in a game of Big Brother. I think the story of Frenchie will be one that is told for years to come. And again, his really terrible, bombastic gameplay led to one of the most sporadic first weeks in the history of the show. And over the course of that week, he had, 5 to 6 different targets, while also promising everyone's safety and creating alliances that no one took seriously. I mean, he really just played terribly, but was such fantastic TV along the way, and is an all-time great early boot character for the show. Now for week 3, where we do get a bizarre HOH comp where Tom Green went on the streets and asked strangers questions that led to a Q&A, which Xavier seems to accidentally win. But this was a solid HOH for him to win, where there is a clear house consensus where everyone wants Brent out. But Brent obviously doesn't know that and is still under the assumption that the slaughterhouse is still together, so Xavier does have to pacify him along the way, pretending like Brent is a pawn for the entire week, which Brent doesn't believe because he doesn't think he's pawn material. But this is also where the edit completely just dunks on Brent, which should have happened a while ago, but here we finally see people like Hannah, Alyssa, and Whitney being annoyed at him, with there being this really notable moment with Alyssa in particular, where he just sees her talking with Christian, and then afterwards he approaches her, telling her about how he was reading their lips while they were talking, and talks about how he trusts her, but not because he wants to date her, which is just such an awkward thing to say. We do have the wildcard comp, which mostly revolves around making sure Brittany didn't win to leave her open as a pawn. And this was a fun comp where you had to micromanage your numbers while harming others. A very math-heavy competition, but we do see DX and Tiffany working together to knock Brittany out of the competition. But it was fun to see that Brittany could have technically taken out Derek X and potentially won the competition had she just done some basic math correctly. But she doesn't, and DX ends up throwing it to Tiffany, who does get the dilemma of giving herself safety, but doing so would give a random person on each of the other teams safety as well. And with this week being one that has a very clear-cut plan, she obviously turns it down. But this comp ends up really pissing off Brittany, and we later have Xavier telling Brittany that she's going to go up again this week, further angering her, and Azza, who feels bad for her, and also simply just doesn't want to deal with consoling her for the rest of the week, does go to Xavier to tell him to nominate her instead. And we do see a lot of her just being upset at Xavier and Tiffany for going for Brittany, which to her is an attack on her game, which really is the first sign at how emotional of a player Azah is on this season, which does lead to some frustration over her not really utilizing some of the potential that she has within the game. But Xavier does still nominate Brent and Brittany and makes a speech as if Brittany is the target, which does lead to a pretty fun reaction from her. And she does act really self-righteous afterwards. And she does have a great quote where she says, "You don't get to feel bad. I'm the one on the block." And it's really moments like this that do make Brittany a really notable figure on this season. But back to the Brent storyline, I mean, the main intrigue here for the rest of the week comes down to whether or not Brent is going to be blindsided, as he does remain so confident throughout the week that he was for sure staying, thinking he had both the aces and the queens on his side, thinking that he had Alyssa on his side, but in reality he had nobody. He even creates this master plan to have the queens pretend that they're voting for him so that they can blindside Xavier, when in reality that's actually what they're doing. So that was fun. Like, we also see him like create this plan that he was going to like stare straight at Xavier and say checkmate when the votes were coming in, which would have been hilarious. But again, the Brent blindside seemed to be on for the majority of the week until Big D had to ruin everything and tell him that he was in danger. And mixing that in with a few slip-ups here and there from people like DX and Christian, Brent knew for sure he was going home by the time of the eviction, which did ruin what could have been a really great blindside, and through that I think made this week kind of underwhelming by the end of it. Let's talk about Brent, who for the most part actually kind of bored me on this season. It really wasn't until it was last week that I started to find him entertaining as kind of a massive doofus in the game. As again, like, the only thing that made him like a somewhat interesting character are the things that made him such a nuisance to the rest of the house, like him having this complete lack of self-awareness and just being downright condescending most of the time. He is in general a really bad player, but again, one that I actually thought had some potential during week 1 after he was able to flip Frenchie so quickly. But he doesn't really do anything impressive afterwards, so for the most part I do feel like he was a bit of a dud on this cast. Now for week 4, where coming into this week the Royal Flush had already pretty much been broken up, with Derek X not wanting Whitney to go, so he did plan on having Whitney win HOH to target the Kings, and the Queens were willing to go along with this plan as well, particularly with targeting Alyssa and Christian as the power duo at this point. But all of this was for naught as Christian wins HOH, which was a team comp that he almost single-handedly wins for his team. And with him being HOH, the plan goes back to putting up Whitney and Hannah. But the debate over who should be targeted here was pretty fun, where the general consensus was to target Whitney, which largely stemmed from Tiffany. But SB does do a lot of work here in trying to put the target into Hannah, and despite Xavier trying to counter this, Alyssa and Christian do end up siding with SB at this point. Now really it doesn't end up mattering anyway, as they were always going to nominate Whitney beside Hannah, and through that, due to the cookout, Hannah would have always stayed here, but it was interesting that they were leaning in the right direction at a point. But Hannah does end up doing effective work here in talking them back out of it, which does end up sticking until the end of the week. But in this fighting to target Hannah, that does end up leading to SB being an easy target for Tiffany moving forward. Now, I do think her closeness with Kyland was the main reason Tiffany wanted to target SB, but really from this point forward, and in week 4 up until she goes home in week 8, SB was Tiffany's clear target the entire way. But the noms do end up being Hannah and Whitney, and after Christian ends up winning veto, the final of his really impressive streak of comp wins on this season, he does end up leaving noms the same. But Whitney does seem to be kind of clueless over what is even going on this entire week, and I really don't get what she was doing here, where she does mention that she is worried that she doesn't know who the target is coming into noms, so it's like, don't you think that's a bad sign? But she doesn't really do much about it. But she is really just thrown under the bus to Alyssa and Christian, as being used as a scapegoat for all of the talk about targeting them this week, despite the fact that almost every non-king was in these talks. But there really is nothing she could do when she's on the block against Hannah. I mean, there's literally no chance for survival there. But there are some other things to talk about from this week. I mean, Whitney does end up getting upset that Derek X is supporting Hannah over her, and does end up throwing him under the bus, but it was, again, never really going to work. I didn't even bother mentioning the wildcard comp this week, which was pretty dull, where Claire wins and gets the dilemma to get safety till jury, which again, like, why wouldn't you take that? We do get some really weird segments on the show, going from like Whitney being shamed for wearing like skimpy outfits in public to Azah talking about her middle school crush on Xavier and her being jealous of Whitney. We have Ozza moonwalking and falling right in front of Xavier, which was a fun moment. But the week does once again have a lot of focus on Tiffany, with her putting the target on SB, largely due to her finding out how close SB and Kyland are due to Kyland slipping up. And this ends up staining her relationship with Kyland. And we have this like really awkward segment where like Tiffany is upset because he didn't say good morning to her. But here we also see Tiffany and Hannah make a final two that does end up being a pretty important relationship for her moving forward. But this is also where Tiffany does really outline the strategy of the cookout, which basically ends up being the brigade strategy, or really the strategy that any secret alliance should execute, where the individual members partner up with other players in order to create these partnerships that are going to be targeted throughout the season, allowing the cookout to always have the numbers to save their person in the scenario where those partnerships are targeted. Again, a very basic strategy, but a really effective one that does allow the cookout to run circles around the rest of the cast. But again, when it comes down to the vote in this round, Whitney is voted out unanimously, and this round does mark the end of the teams and also the wildcard comps, as you would expect from a modern season of Big Brother. But Whitney leaves here, and I feel like along with Travis, is probably going to be one of the more forgettable figures from this cast. Now, most of the other players were running circles around her, but I do think she is a competent player in most scenarios. Again, I think she was on a cast like BB20, BB21. I think she probably ends up doing a lot better. But here, she just didn't seem to have much of a chance. I do think she was too passive a player, particularly in the last couple weeks, and wasn't that notable of a character on the show either. Plus, also had a relatively boring boot week, so I do think she is someone that is going to be largely forgotten about down the road. Now for week 5, where we do start the week with the wall comp, which did have a number of notable moments, like Tiffany and Ozza celebrating when Alyssa fell. And we had it come down to Xavier and Derek X, which was a surprise to me to see Xavier get this far into the comp, especially when he planned on throwing it. But they make a deal leading to DX winning here, but immediately afterwards, Xavier tries to add more conditions to the deal by telling him to keep the entire Kings team safe, which just seems so ridiculous and was never going to work, as Derek X's plan here is to target the Kings, as they are the only team that still have their whole team intact, with the main plan here being to backdoor Christian. And I love how like Xavier's incredulous in the DR over like, why is DX even considering nominating a King? It's like, come on. I think this really shows the flaws in Xavier's game, where he's not very good at recognizing the perspectives of others and gets upset whenever someone does something that is not in his best interest. But DX ends up wanting to nominate SB, who was a possible target in the case that something went wrong here, along with one of the jokers, with that person ending up being Brittany once again. Now SB is eventually clued in on the plan and does end up throwing Christian under the bus, and we do get one of her more notable moments on the season with her singing "Row, row, row your boat" in a really creepy way, where she like changes the words to talking about her betraying her team, and like all that's like really fun, but also just again super creepy. Now we do get the veto pick where Christian isn't picked, but Alyssa is, and through that they plan on tricking Alyssa into playing the veto on SB so that they can still backdoor Christian behind her back, which would have been a lot of fun to see happen. But during the veto comp, which ends up being the Yankee swap comp, which was bizarrely similar to the exercise coach comp from BB14, just not blatantly sexual like that one was. But again, this comp was very bizarre, but Alyssa does end up making it to the final round, where she competes against Brittany in a competition where they have to continuously shake their heads, and Brittany just looks ridiculous while doing it, but she does end up winning the veto here, putting the Christian plan fully into action. But through this comp, we do also get some intrigue from SB fighting to keep her $5,000. That does cause some drama of people being upset that she didn't want to go for the veto. And we have this moment where DX wants to take the money, but is convinced not to. And again, like all this just kind of pisses off a good chunk of the house against SB, particularly Alyssa and the other Kings, who from this point forward actually want SB to go, which kind of severs their relationships with SB. Obviously, punishments do get doled out here, with Claire getting a really boring one. I mean, Kyland has to wear an ass costume and make sandwiches for some reason. But Derek X has the best one, with him being the Lord of the Latrine, which was where he is the only one with the key to the bathroom and has to announce who's using the bathroom every time someone goes in. And again, that was pretty fun. But back to the game itself. Again, right before the veto ceremony, Derek X does decide to tell Alyssa about the backdoor plan, to which she ends up telling Christian, who has this fantastic reaction. And this does lead to a lot of scrambling before the ceremony that I myself even took the time to watch on feeds. I mean, I'll be honest, I don't watch the Raw live feeds as much as I used to, but seeing this in the aftermath of the veto competition was a lot of fun to see live. But I did find it interesting too how this was presented on this show, where we do get a cliffhanger on the Wednesday night episode, where the last thing that we see is Christian pleading to Derek X after they've literally already been called for the ceremony, which I don't think we've ever seen done before. And I do like how they played with the episode formats during this season, where again, we get this type of cliffhanger next week as well, though I do feel like this one worked a lot better than that one. But it was nice to see them change things up, but eventually the plan does go through. Christian does end up getting put on the block, and I will give him all the credit in the world for how much he fought to stay this week. I mean, pretty much does campaign nonstop the entire way through, and while the work he personally put in ends up being pretty ineffective, I do respect how much he really seemed to want to be there. But his best chance of staying was Tiffany, who obviously wanted SB gone, but also had a great relationship with Christian, and for her it was very beneficial to be keeping him around. And this does cause a lot of drama between Tiffany and the Jokers, where she is upset at Ozza and Big D for misleading him, which causes this start of Big D's hatred for Tiffany moving forward. But we also get this fun scene where she does attempt to flip, where she only needs one of the votes from the Jokers and attempts to talk to Brittany without Ozza and Big D, to which they end up interjecting the conversation anyway, leading to more drama between them. But this plan doesn't end up following through, with Kyland getting his way and keeping SB and taking out his biggest threat in Christian. And I do think Kyland ends up doing some really effective work this week, despite him playing a bit too passively in the past few weeks since his HOH. I mean, over the course of one night, he literally is able to completely flip Ozza and Big D on Tiffany. He also re-solidifies his bond with Derek X, and through that puts him in a pretty strong position coming into next week, where he ends up ruining it, which again is very indicative of Kyland as a player. Now, also this week, we do have this pretty fun moment where Tiffany accidentally mentions the royal flush in front of Hannah, leading to her questioning Tiff and Derek X about it, to which Tiff didn't even realize that she had leaked it herself, and all that was pretty fun. But again, as for the round, Christian does end up getting voted out here, which was a very predictable result, but the road there was really fun, and to me this was probably the best week since week 1. Now let's talk about Christian, who was one of the people that I was the lowest on coming into the season, but I leave this season being pretty high on him. I mean, he seems to be a genuinely nice guy and a solid evolution of the Victor archetype. I mean, this nice, young, naive guy that does ridiculously well in competitions, with Christian in particular here winning almost every comp he was a part of, especially when factoring in how he only lost that first HOH due to his team's mistakes. Again, he is a ridiculously good competitor here, and I do think he is probably more strategically savvy of a player than someone like a Victor, though to be fair, not by that much. Again, he's not a strategic mastermind by any means, but again, he created numerous Final 2 deals, he was decently active in the game, so overall I was pretty impressed by Christian here on this season. Now for week 6, which starts off with the knockout HOH comp, which did lead to a lot of drama within the Cookout as they do try to rig the results, but they don't play out as expected. I mean, it was funny how all of the non-Cookout members did end up going out first, again, really showing the stranglehold that the Cookout had on this game, with them getting to the final 11 here with all of their partners still intact. And this is where we get to a pretty strange part in the game where the majority of the Cookout are actively trying to throw their own partners under the bus, which it was interesting to see all these players on a mission sacrificing their own individual games in order to further the cause. And while I do respect the cause, it does lead to a lot of frustration to see players like Tiffany being so willing to cut Claire, Hannah being so willing to cut DX, Kyland being so willing to cut SB, and all of which were against their best interests, and to see all of these players with so much potential actively sabotaging their own personal games along this season. But because of how much control the Cookout end up having on this season, we do see them continuously create plans on how to throw comps to each other and plotting for the best possible outcome for HOH, and this always led to some drama, again, where in this comp here, the plan was for Kyland to throw it to allow SB to be targeted here, but when Kyland gets targeted by Brittany, he ends up retaliating by picking Ozza, and she picks him back until they were up against each other, and despite the plan, again, for him to throw it to Ozza, he ends up winning instead, which just really pisses her off. And we get to the final round where it is Tiffany versus Kyland, where Kyland actually does throw it there, only for Tiffany to end up answering it wrong anyway, accidentally giving Kyland the win, which was all just a really fun sequence of events. But this is Kyland's second HOH, and it's not nearly as successful as his first, where he really ends up doing a lot of the great work he did the previous week, obviously pissing off Azza and further perpetuating this perception that he is selfish within the Cookout. That does end up putting him on the bottom of the group. He also handles his conversations pretty poorly, where he does come off as condescending and continuously talks over people, not giving them much information, and continuously changing his plans along the way. He also kind of neglects certain relationships, particularly his relationship with DX, to where DX does eventually start thinking about potentially targeting Kyland. So again, this is overall pretty bad HOH for Kyland. I mean, his initial target was going to be Claire as a way to weaken Tiffany, and she was someone that he wasn't that close to begin with, but the show really tries to prop it up as, oh, she's being targeted due to her talking about targeting Cookout members, which not really the case. So he does end up nominating Claire along with Big D as a pawn, but the Sunday night episode doesn't end there, where we end up playing with the format once again by instead ending the episode with the High Rollers room, this new twist, which I was okay with at first. I mean, it was a way for America to help out their favorite players, but not in an overly overpowered way. But what is hilarious about this twist that ends up backfiring on the producers in almost every conceivable way, where instead of helping America's favorite, it really just ends up putting a target on their back, where Brittany and DX immediately become targets due to them getting $100, which obviously means that they're a lot more likely to win some of the more powerful powers down the road. So getting rid of them before those powers come up is obviously extremely beneficial to the Cookout, and this twist ends up really re-solidifying the Cookout. Even more so, as again, this twist can easily be gamed with the Majority Alliance, and gave them all a set goal to be striving for in these next few rounds. So again, a twist that the producers clearly didn't fully think through, but I do still think it was an interesting idea, and definitely a more complicated twist than I ever expected Big Brother to actually do. Now, we do see the players entering the room one by one, where they do learn at how much money America ends up giving them, which does lead to some fun moments, particularly from Brittany, who is so pumped when she gets 100. Which again is ironic considering that's the reason why she ends up being targeted. Big D also gets 100, which may or may not have been due to the confusion between the two Dereks. But he does end up lying about it, and the show tries to act like he's successful in this, but I mean, come on, I get everyone knew. But the only power available for this week was the ability to bet on one of the veto players, and if one of them wins the veto, then you get a second veto, which we do see a few players play for it here, but I did find it weird, the mechanics of how this worked, where they first compete in a comp to see who the 6 people who can bet will be, but only 5 of them end up cashing in here. So I don't get why Tiffany wasn't allowed to bet when she scores 0. I mean, she's still technically in the top 6, but whatever, it leads to only 4 people being able to bet, with there being a decent chance of the second veto not even being won, which would have made this entire twist kind of pointless. But Kyland ends up betting on Alyssa, and the veto ends up being Otev, to where they are the final 2. And Kyland ends up once again doing a pretty poor social play here, in him blatantly throwing the comp to Alyssa in order to not give Claire, who bet on him, a veto, but wanting to win a veto himself so he can use the veto on Claire, so that he can gain some sort of social capital with her, which just ends up completely backfiring on him, especially because it just makes him look even more sketchy here. But we do get another cliffhanger in the Wednesday night episode, with SB telling Brittany right before the ceremony that she is going up, and we get this fun segment of her freaking out and trying to find Kyland, where she's upset with him for breaking their deal that she offered of 2 weeks of safety earlier in the week. And I just found it hilarious how in the DR she calls him an arrogant little bitch. But the cliffhanger here was a bit more pointless, where again, it's pretty clear that she was going up, and he does end up using the veto on Claire to put Brittany up. And like last week, we do get a lot of talk about flipping a vote, particularly from Claire and Derek X, who try to get Hannah and Tiffany on board, and they do admit that this would have been their optimal move had they not had the Cookout. But because of the Cookout, they can't flip the vote on Big D. Now, this week is also where DX and Claire are talking, and for an instant, figure out the Cookout, only for them to later brush it off, which is kind of humorous. But As for the vote itself, it is pretty clear that Brittany is going home, and let's talk about Brittany, who did annoy me for a lot of the season, and she was exactly who I expected her to be coming in from the preseason, but by the end of her run here, I did actually find her to be pretty entertaining, largely due to her awkwardness and just how outwardly emotional she was with her numerous freakouts that led to fun TV. But as a player, though, again, she is for the most part pretty mediocre. I do think she actually has more game knowledge than people give her credit for, and can be a competent strategic thinker, though I do think she gets too emotional and probably is too naive to end up winning any given season. Now for week 7, which starts off with an interesting HOH where they had to cross a balance beam course where they had to choose between multiple paths along the way, and I thought this was pretty fun. Though once SB gets through in 21 seconds, people pretty much need a perfect run to end up beating her, and we do see DX almost beat her despite making a mistake, but SB does end up winning here, and this week ends up being a complete train wreck, despite there seeming to be some promise in it early on. Obviously, at this point, the Cookout was very solidified. They were very determined to get to the very end, but with SB, obviously someone not in the Cookout being HOH, and also someone that was a target for the majority of the house coming into this round, it could have led to some really interesting results. I mean, she did talk about targeting Alyssa and Xavier early on, and if the veto had gone down a certain way, I mean, I think there's a big possibility that 2 Cookout members could have been on the block by the end of the week. But this is where Kyland ends up doing some really effective work in manipulating SB into not targeting the Cookout, and getting her to target Derek X instead, while also making it think that it was her idea the entire time. Now again, from an individual standpoint, was this in the best interest of Kyland to do this? I think it's debatable, but you can't deny how effective he was here, to the point where SB literally ends up nominating the exact same people as Kyland did in the previous week, in Claire and Big D. And for all this, I don't feel like Kyland gets the credit he deserves on the show, where they didn't even bother explaining why she ends up nominating the people that she does. But then we get to the High Rollers room, where right before it, we do see Hannah convince Derek X to not play by saying that she will play for him, knowing full well that he is probably going to go home here if he doesn't end up playing for this power. And again, this is really effective work from Hannah's end. But again, not a move that was in her best interest at this point in the game. And she definitely should have been keeping Derek X around, this person who is for sure taking her to the end. I mean, yes, for Hannah, you do have to get rid of him eventually, as he is going to beat you at the end. But to get rid of him this early at the final 10 is pretty insane, even under the context of trying to remain loyal to the Cookout. But Derek X doesn't end up playing, and neither does Hannah, and really no one does, other than Alyssa, who ends up playing, essentially giving her an automatic win. Now, along the way, Claire does also end up getting 100 BB bucks here, up from 50 in the previous week, which really makes you wonder how she didn't realize that this meant that she was in some level of danger. But we do still watch Alyssa play in the boring comp that was supposed to determine the winner, where again she's the only one to play, so again this was entirely pointless. But she does get the roulette power, where bizarrely she ends up saving Big D, which I mean, I guess I get under the context of her not knowing about the Cookout, but it would have been a lot more interesting if she had used it on Claire, especially with X being nominated by the roulette, as again, that would have made it so 2 Cookout members were on the block, and who knows how this week plays out beyond that. But now we do get some drama over Alyssa being upset that she caused Xavier to go on a block, which would have been interesting if he was in any semblance of danger, but again, against Claire, he was obviously had nothing to really worry about here, as this all but guarantees that a non-Cookout member is going to be on the block by the end of the week, which essentially guarantees that a Cookout members not going home. But through this makes it even more questionable about how hard Xavier ends up going for the veto here, where we do get this domino challenge where to win you have to take 3 punishments, and Xavier ends up taking all of the worst punishments. I mean, now 24-hour solitary confinement and losing your BB bucks aren't that lethal to his game at the end of the day, but for him to take the 3rd nominee punishment is just insane to me. So you are trying to win this veto, to take yourself off the block, to guarantee your safety for this week, only to put yourself in this same position next week, in a position where you're definitely going to be in more danger than you were this week, where again, this week you're guaranteed safety. Why are you wanting yourself as a 3rd nominee next week? It makes no sense. Especially when like Derek X isn't even playing here. I mean, that's the only scenario where you would be screwed over. I mean, like if Derek X wins the veto, uses it on Claire, a Cookout member would have to go home, as literally every non-Cookout member is safe. But again, that didn't happen. That wasn't even a possibility. So I really don't get why Xavier even tries to win this veto. And especially going for it that hard to where he's taking punishments to win the veto, even though it doesn't end up really affecting anything by the end of it. Now we do have Tiffany end up fighting pretty hard here to try and save DX, where she tries to campaign to get Hannah up instead, but it is ineffective, leading to SB still nominating him, which the show doesn't really highlight how bad of a move this was for SB's game. Though, I mean, I guess without the context of the Cookout, obviously it is a lot harder to see that, but she really does nothing to boon her game this week, and instead all but guarantees that she is once again going to be the target coming into the next week. After the veto ceremony, we do see a lot from Tiffany once again, of her again trying to save DX, literally telling him word for word what he should say, and he ends up doing really effective work in flipping Azah to where she does decide to want to keep him around, only for her to be talked down by Xavier, which the show showed out of order. But again, the women of the Cookout do end up wanting to keep Derek X around, but they just couldn't get the men on board, particularly Xavier, though he obviously gets his 24-hour solitary confinement to where Derek X once again does effective work in trying to cause the flip, or again, it is greatly considered again, but ironically now with Xavier in solitary, they decide not to do it as they don't want to leave him out of the plan. So because of all this, Derek X does still end up going home, despite having a very solid campaign. Now, along the way, we do also get this really awkward segment on the show about the Red Cross, where it really just felt like CBS patting themselves on the back for caring about charity more so than them actually helping the Red Cross. We also do get a very awkward eviction where Julie uncomfortably tries to call Derek X Baby D, and we do also have Derek X calling SB Nicole F, to which SB misheard him and doesn't get annoyed about this comment until later in the day. But we also have Xavier coming out solitary, walking super slow, wearing this massive wig. Again, all on live TV, and this was just so humorous to me. As you could just tell that the producers were probably so pissed in the control room. But let's talk about Derek X, who I was pretty high on in the preseason, under the assumption that he was this massive fan on the show. But then it turned out that all the references that he puts in his bio were under the direction of producers. But despite him not knowing much about the game, he did quickly learn the game, and despite his somewhat low placement on the season, I do think he is one of the players that has demonstrated the most potential over the course of this season, more so than like certain other players that have gotten further into the game. Again, like I think there were a decent amount of comparisons to him and Paul from BB18. I think Derek X showed more potential on this season than Paul did in that season. I mean, I have literally no doubt that Derek X could easily win any given game of Big Brother, and I wouldn't be surprised if he were to eventually return again down the road and do very well. And he's also just a really likable guy as well, so I do come out of the season being pretty high on Derek X. Now for week 8, where we do get a Q&A comp that Tiffany ends up winning, making it pretty clear the target this week is finally going to be SB, as it should have been weeks ago. And she obviously plans on nominating Kyland. And really, there isn't that much intrigue for the nominations here. I mean, yes, we see SB trying to throw Alyssa under the bus. I mean, yes, we see SB find out how angry Tiffany is at her for getting rid of Derek X, but it's like, really, none of this matters too much. We do get to the High Rollers room, where coming into this round, the only people who could even afford the Coin of Destiny are Big D and Hannah, though the players are randomly given envelopes that either have 50 or 100 BB bucks in them, and that does allow Claire to also be able to afford the Coin of Destiny as well. And once this becomes apparent, I did really like what Hannah did here, where if the Coin of Destiny power ends up getting used, the winner will not be able to play in the next HOH, as they are essentially the HOH, while Tiffany, the overthrown HOH, will get to play in the next HOH. Again, very much greatly benefiting the odds of a Cookout HOH in the next round, and essentially just making it the Cookout versus Alyssa. So I did like to see Hannah convince the entire Cookout to not play and hand Claire the Coin of Destiny, as I do think that was the optimal move for them at this point, and I think it was a pretty great idea. But with that, Claire does obviously end up winning the Coin of Destiny and underwhelmingly does nothing with it. I mean, this is a ridiculous power where if you win the comp, which Claire did, the HOH has to flip a coin, and if the coin winner gets it right, they get to take over as an invisible HOH. And Claire could have done so much with that power here. While again, it would have been tough to get anything through without the foresight of the Cookout, to see her just take this power and do exactly what Tiffany just did was so underwhelming and also just not beneficial to her game. And the entire ending to the Sunday night episode was just so ridiculous, where we get this slow-mo and added drama to this very simple coin flip. But we follow that up with SB and Kyland being taken off the block, only for them to be nominated once again immediately afterwards. Like, it was just such a dumb end to the episode. We then get a bizarre veto comp where Ben Platt from Dear Evan Hansen introduces the comp, and the winner gets to watch the movie, which felt like the first movie reward in a while, but it was just bizarre to see this show that is currently being promoted as this summer fun reality show to have an ad for a film about depression and suicide in it. But then we get to the comp, which we have seen in the past, of them organizing these photos in chronological order, which is just as ridiculous as ever, but they really do end up going pretty long here on this comp, with them having no real intrigue going on here that will end up mattering for this week. But Hannah ends up winning here, sealing SB's fate. But we once again get Kyland ruining his relationship within the Cookout by trying to get the veto used on him, to which he has this great DR from Tiffany, where she says, "Shut the F up, Kyland." But we do get Hannah using the veto on Xavier instead, which kind of comes out of left field on this show, but I do think it was a good move for Hannah, building her trust with Alyssa, which pacifies Alyssa moving forward. But again, SB and Kyland are on the block. SB goes home. But despite how predictable that was, we did get a really fun Thursday night episode, which ends up being probably one of my favorite episodes of the entire season. I mean, we do see Alyssa realize after this week that Claire will be the only white person left, which frustrates Xavier. And he ends up ranting about her in the bathroom, talking about how now we have to get rid of you next, which is like kind of ridiculous and doesn't end up even happening. We see the Cookout get together for the first time, which was really fun, where it really highlighted a lot of these characters here, particularly like Tiffany being super excited and trying to pump everyone up. We see Kyland walking in and the group just stopped talking, worried it was someone else, only to get excited when like it was most of the Cookout already there. We have Hannah waking up Xavier to officially have the meeting, and we have him being grumpy the entire scene. So again, I felt like all this was pretty fun and kind of indicative of the radically different characters that are within the Cookout. And after that, we get this really fantastic sequence that really highlights so many characters in a way that we rarely see on Big Brother. And we see Azah and Claire burning their dinner while outside at the same time Big D gets scared by a beetle, causing him to jump out of his hammock, causing Hannah to fall on her head, which is a scene that's filled with just, again, so many small, fun character moments that really do help you learn more about the majority of this cast. But following these great character moments, we do also get a lot of strategy, showing the inner dynamics of the Cookout, where we see the guys get together, and through this we see X's plan moving forward, with him having a final 3 with the guys, but also having one with Hannah and Tiffany. We do also see Big D talking about wanting to go to the end with the 3 guys, as both of them are willing to take him to the end. Though at the same time, we do see Kyland talk about being worried about Big D winning the game, which was a complete misread on his end, but he does look at Big D as a jury threat. And we follow this up with a scene between Tiffany and Kyland, where they re-solidify their bond and plan on targeting Big D and Xavier. But we also get this DR from both of them talking about their endgame plans, where Kyland talks about how he wants to go to the end with Tiffany, only for Tiffany to talk about how she wants to go to the end with Hannah. And through these two pretty short scenes, we learn so much so quickly about the endgame plans of the majority of the Cookout. And I did really like how effectively the show portrayed this, showing more of the strategy to the audience here. And all of that was really great to me. And for the vote itself, it is pretty boring with SB being voted out here. Though even within that, we get a pretty fun moment where they accidentally turn Azah's picture black and white, and we have the entire house like freaking out on live television right before the interview, so that was fun as well. But again, we do lose SB, and despite how poorly she played in these last few weeks and how much the majority of the audience seemed to hate her towards the end of her run, I will admit, I do still like SB. I still think that she has a decent amount of potential as a player, but I do think she was way too passive for the majority of this game, while also coming out as too aggressive during the points where she did decide to play a bit more actively. Plus also she just gets completely snowed by Kyland, and her relationship with him really ends up putting a target on her back and really isolates her from a lot of the other players within the game. But I will say that I did find her to be a fun villain while she was utilized on the show. I don't think she was used nearly as much as I would have liked her to, but she did have some notable moments, so I did like her presence on the show, though I do think she gets pretty overshadowed by so many other figures on this cast. Now for week 9, where we do get endurance comp, and it was funny to see Julie set this up as the Cookout versus Alyssa, and literally before the episode ends, Alyssa has already dropped. So, I mean, a Cookout member was winning here, though we do once again get a lot of drama from the plan going wrong, where the consensus before the comp was to throw it to Azah, but after X throws the competition, both Kyland and Tiffany don't let go, and Azah naturally drops, leading to, again, the plan going wrong, where Tiffany ends up winning, which was one of the scenarios that they were actively trying to avoid, as because of this, Tiffany's obviously going to try to keep Claire safe here. But also because of this, Xavier ends up being very upset, and he ends up spending the entire week complaining about Tiffany. And it was really frustrating to me to see how genuinely upset he was at Tiffany for playing selfishly when, like, he's the one that's playing the most selfishly out of the entire Cookout. I mean, he's the only one who never seemed to genuinely want to take out one of his partners in the game. He continuously threw comps, which he claimed was to benefit the Cookout, though in reality it was to reduce his own threat level. He was pissed whenever any of the kings were targeted, and again, he wasn't willing to get rid of one of them as one of his pawns unless it was absolutely necessary. And even in this upcoming week, he ends up planning on throwing the HOH to Alyssa so that Alyssa can get rid of Tiffany for him, again, before the final 6. So all of this was really frustrating to me because, like, he just simply wouldn't shut up about it, where he literally just went from person to complain about Tiffany. And if this was a game move, I would fully respect this, because getting rid of Tiffany at this point is his optimal move, and through complaining about Tiffany, his bond with Big D is bolstered. But he clearly did genuinely believe it, as he talks about it in the DR, and we do see him and Big D being, like, visibly upset during the HOH room reveal. And overall, I was just annoyed too that the show seemed to side with Xavier in this argument, where they make it seem like, oh, the consensus of the Cookout was that they were going to target Claire, when, like, in reality it was 50-50. And the edit does lean towards giving Tiffany a bit more of a villainous edit there. But she obviously does end up targeting Alyssa and does put up X as a pawn. And once again, XX super bitter here, talking about how he wants to win the veto while he's on the blocks just so that he can use it on Alyssa, just to screw over Tiffany by forcing her at that point to put up Claire, which is, again, insane. As if Tiffany is as selfish as he claims to be, like, what was stopping her from putting up Big D at that point and then them just sending Xavier home? Like, it's insane to me that this is even a thing that he actually considers. And even then, even if she does put up Claire, like, wouldn't the Cookout be annoyed at him for using the veto on a non-Cookout member? So really, again, this is just a terrible plan, though. I mean, again, it would have been hilarious to see him execute. Definitely better than what we actually got, where we did get the worst case scenario here with Alyssa winning the veto and in turn truly forcing Tiffany to backdoor her best friend here in Claire. Which, the scene of Tiffany telling Claire she was going on the block was a pretty heartwarming scene. I mean, to see, like, Claire be fully understanding there was nice to see, and I definitely do hope Claire does get a shot to play again at some point down the road. But outside of that moment, which happened at the end of the Wednesday night episode, I do feel like the Wednesday night episode this week was probably one of the worst episodes of the show I've ever watched. I mean, it was just so cringy. And we had this, like, BB23 music segment, which, like, parodied these old music compilation ads, and that was just bizarre. We get Zingbot, which just gets worse and worse every year, with none of the jokes hitting from my point of view. We see the return of the micro stacking comp, which went on for way too long, even though I do actually like the competition itself. But through that, we also get the return of this ridiculous laser beam thing that they had last season, that, again, they pretend like they're shrinking people, and, like, all this is just so cringy. Again, terrible episode. But again, Claire does get backdoored, and due to double eviction, we literally see none of her campaign on the show, which I will say that I do think she did actually a pretty good job. But again, it was never going to work, obviously, with the Cookout here, but again, it does give me a bit more faith in Claire as a player. We did also miss out on Alyssa thinking that she was, like, the mastermind of the Claire backdoor, so that was fun, but we still do get the segment of Alyssa talking about the final 7 being POCs, and we get the reactions from individual Cookout members of them pretending to be shocked, and that was pretty fun. But very abruptly, we get to the eviction, and Claire ends up going home. And I was pretty happy to see Claire on this season. I mean, she was also an alternate for Christy, who I am very content with, never seeing her play Big Brother. But Claire is someone that I knew the game in and out. Like, I think she's probably one of the most meta players we've seen in the show, especially from outside of an All-Star season. I mean, she's a massive fan of these social strategy games. I mean, she's the co-creator of Survivor Michigan, which is my personal favorite college Survivor series. So I was pretty high on Claire coming into the season, and I do still have faith in Claire's strategic ability even after the season. Like, yeah, she did make some mistakes, a lot of those being under the context of her not knowing that the Cookout existed. And obviously you have to get frustrated with what she did towards the end of her run with like the Coin of Destiny, but I still do look at her as a player with a lot of potential, and I do think she does have a pretty notable exit here that I hope bolsters her chances of coming back. Again, do I really think it's likely? Probably not, but I would definitely like to see her get back to have more of a fair chance in the game. As again, like I do think if this game played out naturally without the Cookout, I do think Claire would have been in a pretty solid spot, riding with Tiffany to the end, and possibly having the chance to cut her at 3. But we do end up following that up with the first double eviction, which I will mention that we do get 2 double evictions in a row here instead of a triple, and I personally like that format a lot more. Now, I do think that this was a last-second change once they realized that they would miss out on the historic moment at Final 6 with the Cookout, but hopefully they do stick with this moving forward, as while the triple can be this like big, massive event, it also usually takes away from the most interesting parts of the game. While I do feel like the double allows for there to be a bit more room to breathe. Now, again, ideally, I would like them split up a bit more. But for this one season to have them back-to-back, it was an interesting thing to have. As for the double itself, we do see Hannah winning HOH. And something I loved is that we were able to actually see the one-on-ones before cutting to commercial. And it was pretty humorous to me to see how quick Hannah went through all the Cookout members, where she would just literally tell them the noms and they would leave. But then when Alyssa comes in, they have a long talk where Hannah continues to lie to her about how X is the target. And even after Xavier wins veto, Hannah still tries to pacify her, when at this point it literally doesn't matter. Though obviously, like within the show, the context is missed out that they did actually just make a Final 2 deal not too long ago. But still, I don't think this is the greatest jury management there. And I do think her putting up Kai was a pretty big misstep, as Kai is someone that would take it personally, and definitely someone that has the potential to retaliate. So I didn't like that decision either. But Alyssa still does end up going home, and we do end the episode with the Cookout celebrating, and this just felt right. I mean, while I did get frustrated throughout the season over how the members of the Cookout weren't playing in their best interest, to me, the season would just be a complete letdown if the Cookout did not get to the Final 6. It would have felt like a waste to see these players like Tiffany, Kyland, and Hannah waste a lot of the potential that they had and not play as optimally as they possibly could have if they didn't end up accomplishing their goal here. And through us seeing the Cookout finish their mission here, it does feel like we've kind of leveled out the playing field to where these type of sacrifices don't need to be made in the game moving forward. And hopefully we can have a more natural game in future seasons. But I guess we should also talk about the accomplishment that this is for the Cookout. This has never been done before. I mean, this is actually an incredible feat that this forced in alliance, this alliance of that was essentially just all the black people coming together. Again, this grouping of people that had no real other connection outside of the fact that they were black. Typically, when you have this grouping that's this very arbitrary combination of people, it doesn't typically work, but the Cookout did make it work. Now, obviously, a lot of this is because of their mission and that they were also dedicated to that mission. But on that end, again, it is impressive that this alliance was as successful as it is, but also, again, they made the Final 6. These 6 people that at the beginning of the game agreed to stick together actually made it to the Final 6 without losing any casualties along the way is insane. Especially when we consider the fact that in comparison to a lot of these other more dominant alliances of the show, the Cookout didn't win nearly as many competitions as something like the Committee, which also came very close to accomplishing this feat. So again, the fact that Cookout made it to Final 6 here is an insane feat and something that definitely should be celebrated even from a gameplay perspective. Before moving on, let's talk about Alyssa, who was fine. I do think Alyssa on a normal season would be a pretty competent player. Again, another one of these people that I think would probably do well on a cast like BB20 or BB21. But here, I mean, she was just in over her head. I mean, she was so blind to the Cookout, and that did lead to some fun character moments. But I do think that is indicative of her gameplay, where it was never even a possibility to her, despite her even noticing how many people of color were left in the game. But I do think she has a decent strategic mind, and I think she is someone that could do well in any given season, but this was just not the season for her. And in terms of a character, I just think she gets outclassed by a lot of other more notable figures on the show. And now for week 10, where the Cookout finally has to turn against each other, which we've been waiting for 4 weeks now, but it doesn't play out in the way that I think really anybody wanted it to. And a lot of this comes from Kyland, who does end up having a lot of power over the next couple rounds. And Kyland's entire philosophy over how he wants to play this endgame is completely insane to me, where he wants to take the best to the end so that he can beat the best, which in itself, again, is completely misguided, especially in terms of modern day standards. But again, like, you could see the rationale behind it, largely because, I mean, he has such a massive ego. But what makes this even more frustrating is who he perceives to be the best and why he perceives that person to be the best. Where up until this week, he had been debating over who to bring to the end between Tiffany and Xavier. But now he ends up going all in on the Xavier bandwagon, thinking that he is the best, largely because he's been told that Xavier is the best. Not actually because Xavier is actually the best. Again, it's because people like Tiffany and Hannah and Claire and even SB have been trying to convince Kyland to target Xavier to benefit their own individual games, not because Xavier had actually done anything to actually make him the best in the game, which is really just a massive stroke of luck that booned Xavier's game, all while taking out the actual best player due to Kyland's misconception of the game. But to go along with that, Kyland does also get content at the start of the week with Kyland being pissed with most of the Cookout over how he was the pawn next to Alyssa and no one reassured him, which I do think greatly bruised his ego, and I do think played into the decision of him targeting Tiffany this week, despite Tiffany being the only one that actually fought to get him not on the block. We do get the HOH where Kyland accidentally ends up winning, where he was trying to throw it to Big D. And for some reason, this comp was hosted by the Cluckster, also known as the same actor guy that shows up every season, but this time he's in a chicken costume, so that was obviously necessary. Now, obviously, Kyland does end up putting up Tiffany and Hannah, with Tiffany as the target, despite having a final 3 with them, which he tries to rationalize as it's because she lied to him, when it's like, really, the entire Cookout kind of lied to you? Again, like, the entire Cookout was planning on taking you out at 6, and actually it was Tiffany in the last few weeks that have been trying to save you, but whatever. But I did love Tiffany's DR after a nomination ceremony where she ends up calling Kai the smartest idiot she's ever met in her life. But really, this is such a tragic way to start the Cookout turning against each other, especially considering how much potential Tiffany showed during this season and how much she did for the Cookout. And to see all that not being recognized was one of the major frustrations over the course of how this week played out, especially of how the men were rationalizing this targeting of Tiffany on the fact that she has done the least for the Cookout, when in reality she's done the most. And really, this was just such a terrible look for the men of the Cookout here, with some pretty clear underlying misogyny in how they looked at the game, where conveniently the 3 that they consider having done the most for the Cookout are the 3 men, with 2 of them being Xavier and Big D, who probably did some of the least for the Cookout. Now, the veto episode was pretty dull as well. They do try to prop up the idea of Azza winning the veto and using it to blindside one of the men, but I mean, come on, that was never actually happening, especially because Azza was in on it and was completely fine with going to the end with the guys and losing to either Xavier or Big D, which was another level of frustration over the end game here and how Azza was even trying to win here. The veto does end up being BB Comics, where the comics themselves were just as half-assed as they have been in recent years, and coming into the comp, I really did think Hannah had a good chance of winning it, which if she had won, that would have led to a lot of intrigue for the week. But Kyland ends up winning instead, and to make matters worse, they really end up dragging out this comp on the show with so many cringy DRs talking about the comics, and the most hilarious of them to me being Hannah clearly being forced to explain why people call her Chada, as it's mentioned in the comic, but they never mention it on their show. So I found that kind of funny, but it was also surprising to see that Big D came in second in this comp. And I love how the show kind of starts to show his delusion in the game here, where we get this DR from him talking about how he's worried that because he came in second in 2 comps in a row that he's going to be perceived as a comp beast. Again, Big D is the one saying this. Now, Kai does actually consider using the veto on Hannah pretty briefly, but Xavier ends up talking him out of it. And we do get Tiffany actually trying to campaign for herself, and she does do a decent job, though it doesn't really end up going through. She does effective work on Azza to get her on her side and get it to the point where Azza's even campaigning for her, but Xavier doesn't decide to flip, though he does actually second guess himself at a point. And we also get a fun moment during her campaign where we see more of Big D's delusion with him talking about how close the vote would be between him and Xavier, to which Tiff just immediately shuts him down, which was funny. But sadly, Tiffany does end up going home here unanimously. And let's talk about Tiffany, who surprisingly to me was the star of the season. I mean, again, in the preseason, I really got almost nothing from her. Her bio was very bare bones. So to see how great she was on the show, both from a gameplay and character standpoint, was a pretty big surprise. I mean, she made fantastic TV with really amazing DRs and had an extremely savvy strategic mind for the game. And through her also making really great social bonds, I do think she is probably the best player of the season. Now, it is a shame that this is the season where the Cookout had to be a thing, as without that, I do think Tiffany would have been able to position herself a lot better by taking people like Claire and DX further into the game, people who wanted to take her towards the end of the game, instead of people like Xavier and Big D, who wanted her out first from the Cookout. Now, I'm not saying that she was a flawless player. I mean, she did manage her relationships with Azza and Big D pretty poorly. She wasn't able to maintain her relationships with Xavier and Kyland, both of which wanted to take her to the end at one point. But then again, those things wouldn't have mattered if she had not bothered to take the Cookout to the end anyway. To where I 100% believe that people like Xavier and Big D would not have made it as far as they did had the Cookout not existed. So through this season, I do still have a lot of confidence in Tiffany's overall game ability, and she is someone that I would love to see return for the next returnee season. But afterwards, this is where we get the second double eviction, which was a much more somber one than the previous one. Obviously, the previous one ended with the Cookout getting to 6. This one concludes with now us losing 2 massive fan favorites, and pretty much everyone left in the game seemingly handing Xavier the win. I also felt like the presentation of this double was really underwhelming, where I had praised how the previous one had been shown. Despite it being a live 1-hour double, this was a pre-taped 2-hour double, and somehow we get even less of the gameplay during the double itself, with them saving a lot of it for the following episode, despite, again, this being pre-taped. And to waste even more time, we get a 2-part HOH, which felt pointless, but Azza ends up winning her first comp of the season, and ends up putting up Hannah and Xavier, with her duping Hannah into thinking that Xavier is the target. But we do get this conversation between Azza and Hannah where you could see the drop on her face when she hears she's going to be nominated, and you obviously feel for her there. But really, Hannah needs to win the veto here, which turns out to be what the bleep. And like the last veto, I came into this thinking Hannah probably has the best shot here. But no, once again, Kyland wins the veto. And the main intrigue here comes from him using the veto on Xavier, which did feel pointless at this point. I mean, it really just exposes how close he is to Xavier, to Big D, for no real reason, while also pissing off Azza and Big D, who didn't know he was going to do it at the time. I mean, he really gains nothing from this move, considering obviously Xavier still wants to cut him anyway. And really, this was another opportunity for him to take X out here, but he just doesn't do it. Hannah goes home, which really made this night extremely depressing to see the players that I always thought were going to be the final 2 go home back to back here. But let's talk about Hannah, who I did really like on this season. I mean, she was a fun personality, despite her not being as prominent on the show as I would have liked. But she also seemed like a pretty solid player. Now, I do think she was a bit overrated as a player due to how much of a fan favorite she was, especially from BB Twitter. But I do think she is a player with a lot more potential than what we actually saw on this season. I do think she gets pretty poor reads at points that stem from her overconfidence in certain information that is just factually wrong. But she did do some pretty solid work throughout the season, like convincing Christian and Alyssa to keep her safe over Whitney, her convincing Derek X to not play in the high rollers room, and convincing the Cookout to throw the coin of destiny to Claire. But sadly, very few of her moves actually end up benefiting her in the game and really just end up obviously benefiting the Cookout as a whole, more so. So obviously, again, like we don't really see her be able to play for herself. So she's another one that I would like to see get a chance to play again so that we can actually see how good she really is. Now for week 11, the final 4 round, which we got an entire week. So as expected, this was mostly boring, as this round can usually be finished within the course of like 2 days. But we do see the ramifications of the double, with Azah and Big D being pissed that Kai used the veto on Xavier. And you can clearly tell throughout this week that Azah does regret what she did during her HOH reign, though it does end up working out for her here. We end up having a bizarre HOH comp that was sponsored by CSI Vegas, where for the first time, I believe this entire season, Xavier wins a comp that Kyland participated in. And he does so again later in the final veto competition of the season, where even more surprisingly, Kyland ends up being the first one out of that competition. And through these 2 comp results, it's pretty clear here that Xavier is going to end up targeting Kyland here, which I do think is a questionable move. I mean, in a normal game of Big Brother, I mean, this is a standard move. You wouldn't expect someone like Kyland to want to take someone like Xavier to the end. But Kyland, again, has such a massive ego that he actually does. So by targeting Kyland here, he is getting rid of someone who wants to take him to the end, while keeping someone around that openly talks about wanting him out at 3 in Azah. So while I don't fault Xavier for having this read, I do think it is suboptimal gameplay here. And this week is really just filled with terrible gameplay throughout. I'm, again, from having Azah openly telling Xavier that she's going to take Big D to the end, and Xavier doing the same thing back. Big D's delusions continue to get the better of him, with him getting into constant fights throughout the week. I mean, largely with Azah over how much he dragged her through the game. And also with his decision on who to vote out, where he has to be convinced by Xavier to vote out Kai, which is 100% in his best interest, where Kai has a high likelihood of winning final HOH and wouldn't end up taking Big D to the end, while Azah will obviously end up taking him, but he has to be strong-armed into taking her to 3, again by Xavier, who actually gets put in a worse position by executing this move. Also here, Big D ends up telling Azah about how he has to deal with both Xavier and Kyland, essentially telling her that she's probably going to get voted out here. And this is all before the veto competition, in a scenario where she could still win the veto and have the sole vote to evict. Where again, if this was any normal season, this is such a misstep from Big D, where Azah has every right to vote him out at that point. Big D also gets in arguments with Kyland throughout the week, with this being poor gameplay from Kyland's end, as Kyland again needs Big D's vote to stay this week. We also get this weird segment about Kyland constantly sniffing things. Including him smothering his face into tortillas, and that's just weird, but he does explain why he does it on the feeds, but still, again, it's weird to see. And really, for the majority of the week, it is pretty clear that Kyland is going home here, with the only real intrigue here being if Big D is going to accidentally say the wrong name, which is something Big D seems to be prone to do, and also the fact that Kyland is actually getting blindsided here, which Kyland definitely should have picked up on, considering how awkward all of his conversations with Xavier were, where X usually stumbled about with his responses and wouldn't give him straight answers. But this does lead up to the vote where Kyland is blindsided by Big D, and we get what is probably the most icky moment of the entire season, where on Kyland's way out, he asks Big D and Xavier why they didn't give him the heads up. And at first, this was great TV. At first, this was like bitter Kyland on the way out the door. He even stands by the door, still talking to Big D and Xavier, asking them for a reason, and all that was great until he starts talking about Xavier's nephew, which was obviously just unnecessary and really just shows this other side of Kyland that we've seen plenty of from his social media and even on the feeds, but this is really the first time that it was shown on the show, and for it to be on live TV as well, and him seeming to be proud of this. Again, he leaves the house smiling, and he really has no remorse for anything he said during his exit interview. It really shows how much of a narcissist he really is, especially when he awkwardly ends his interview pretty much just pleading to come back to play again, which I would guess is not super likely based on this stunt. But also the fact that, again, it's pretty clear production did not like him along the way. So again, this was a very explosive and very awkward end to what was a pretty boring week. But let's talk about Kyland, who, again, seems like a massive narcissist. I mean, there's a lot of questionable actions he does throughout the season, with him making some comments that are massive red flags for who he is as a person outside of the game. But within the context of the game, I do think he is one of the best players of the season, where despite having a rocky level of influence in the game, I mean, he does do some very impressive work at points in manipulating people into doing what he wants them to do. I do think he was the second most important player to the success of the Cookout, but he does have such a major fatal flaw in the way that he just looks at the game. I mean, he preaches about honor and, again, wants to take the best to the end, which is just an extremely misguided way of playing the game Big Brother, especially in the modern day. But he does actually have an impressive game resume on this season that does make him one of the better players, despite him being a very questionable person outside of the game. And now let's talk about the final week, the final 3 round, which from a TV standpoint, I mean, as you would expect, up until the finale, it was pretty terrible, with us getting 2 episodes before it for some reason, with most of both of those episodes being recaps. And to see these like game recaps from each of the players was pretty frustrating to watch, with the level of delusion that was coming from all of them, but especially Big D and Xavier, who really try to take credit for things that they straight up didn't do. And really, this final 3 as a whole was a pretty disappointing outcome for this season, where despite all 3 obviously being in the Cookout, I mean, these were the 3 players that had the least to do with the success of the Cookout, and in turn didn't know the reality of how they actually got there, with Big D and Xavier thinking that they were the masterminds, while in reality, most of the things that they attempted failed. But through the successes of Tiffany, Hannah, and Kyland, they were able to get to the 6, where Xavier pretty much just lucks his way into a good position. It takes Oz and Big D to 3. I mean, it is an extremely underwhelming outcome for a season, to where it felt like everyone here really just backed off the success of others, with none of them really knowing how the game was played. But somehow, despite that, where most final 3 rounds are pretty boring, with the results being pretty foreshown, we instead get a decent amount of intrigue here in the final week, mostly stemming from how terrible of a player Big D is. Where it seemed like it was a clear-cut thing, where after Xavier wins part 1, Ozza wins part 2, that was going to come down to the final part where they were both taking Big D to the end, and whoever won that final HOH was going to win. But essentially, again, Big D was locked in for the final 2, but he just couldn't shut up, and continuously berated Ozza and her game throughout the week, saying that he dragged her there, which is clearly not true, and constantly got into arguments with her until it got to the point where she changes her mind and plans to take Xavier to the end, despite her again winning against Big D and clearly losing to Xavier, which is terrible from both Big D and Ozza, and once again benefits Xavier despite the fact that he did nothing to do this, and again, it's him benefiting from the failure of others, which is what my major frustration is with Xavier as a player. But eventually we do get to part 3 of the HOH, where, I mean, Xavier just dominates there, and at that point, the finale was pretty much over. Obviously, he was going to win the game. He does expectedly vote out Ozza, and let's talk about her. I mean, Ozza is a really likable person. I have nothing bad to say about her on that end, but she is a pretty terrible player. I mean, she is a very emotional player, one that really plays for the group more so than for her as an individual. And that was really disappointing to see, considering how big of a fan she is. I mean, I think it just makes it clear that she's just not meant to play a social strategy game like this, where she gets to the 3 here, despite the fact that she constantly talks about wanting to lay down her game for X and Big D, and even when she had a chance to win the game here, she would have decided to essentially throw it away because Big D was a dick. And again, this is poor gameplay from Big D, but also poor gameplay from her. And really, I just ended up being let down by the game she played on this season. But beyond this, we have a really terrible jury questioning segment that is still blowing my mind that we still have this terrible format. And at this point, it really just feels like a formality than an actual game mechanic. And this one in particular felt very robotic and very unprepared, where it literally just feels like they were just handed these cards at the last second. And we don't even get questions from the two people who understand the game the best here in like Tiffany and Claire. And it really just felt half-assed. I mean, I do feel like both X and Big D performed pretty terribly through the questioning itself as well, with both of them taking credit for things that, again, they clearly didn't do. I mean, the jury just openly laughs at Big D, which I feel like we've never seen a jury do that before. And I think it's more so indicative, again, how poorly Big D played and how delusional he is. I do think X had a decent final speech where, I mean, at least he was somewhat accurate on his game. But again, I mean, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. I mean, they vote. We get an awkward reunion segment that did go on for longer than what we normally get. And I actually did enjoy the segment as a whole, though realistically, it's like I'd be more content with the shorter reunion if we were to get better jury questioning. But again, that's not happening. But through this, we did get some fun interactions between X and Big D when they were revealing their secrets. Brittany got a nice moment where she got to reveal that she has autism, though it's awkwardly followed up by Julie Chen telling her that she should have sat down. We got another awkward moment between Kai and X where they talk about their argument and Kai gives this really half-assed apology. But beyond all of this, I mean, X obviously wins the game here. He ends up winning unanimously, even getting Kyland's vote, which, I mean, at this point, an X win was probably the best possible outcome. I mean, obviously, I was disappointed in how the season ended up playing out, and would have preferred some of the more important players to have made it to the end and won. But, again, out of Big D and Azza, I mean, X is at least a competent player. And we do also at least end the episode on a high note with Tiffany being awarded America's favorite player, which felt like a nice consolation prize for her essentially sacrificing her game for the cause, as I do truly believe that she would have been the most likely winner had she been able to play the game that she wanted to. But again, seeing her get fan favorite here was nice to see, so I was at least happy with that result here. But with that, I mean, let's move on to talking about the final two, starting off with Big D, who I think at this point is clearly the worst player to ever make it to the finals, and probably even beyond that as well. I mean, he is an outright terrible player. I mean, one that greatly benefited by the cookout, especially from the jury phase on, and one that is actively bad at the game, one that would continuously sabotage their game in most scenarios. I mean, we explicitly saw this in the last 2 rounds of the season here, where he acts against his best interests at every single opportunity. There is also some ickiness with Big D in terms of his like pretty blatant misogyny at points, but for the most part though, I do actually find him to be a fun character. Like I do find him to have a fun energy to him that, again, outside of the points where he is being misogynistic, I did find his personality to be fun, and I did enjoy seeing his delusion that he displayed throughout the season. But despite how much I found him to be an interesting character, I mean, he is still going to go down in history as one of the worst players to ever make a deep run on a season of Big Brother. Now let's talk about Xavier, who was my winner pick, who, again, at least I got that right, but I was not particularly happy with this outcome, especially at the point that we got the Cookout the 6. But again, like once we're down to those 3, I mean, all 3 of them are not particularly great options, but Xavier is clearly the best of the 3. For me, Xavier is a player that benefited so much off the mistakes of other players, and also just got very lucky that this was the season that the Cookout existed, as he was the best positioned within the Cookout, but did very little to actually make himself the best positioned in the Cookout. And the most frustrating thing about all of this is the fact that he was so delusional in the game about how much he did, with him thinking that his actions throughout the game were effective when really they weren't. And it was players like Tiffany and Kyland and Hannah that had to keep him safe throughout the game, either due to obviously the concept of the Cookout or due to Kyland's ego, which again is something I wouldn't give Xavier really any credit for. And the illusion over the game that he played on this season is something that does affect my assessment of him as a player, as I do think it shows a lack of self-awareness within the game. That being said, I don't think he's a bad player. I mean, actually the opposite. I think he is a great all-around player, but one that does have massive holes in their game, especially on this season, that I do think if this season hadn't played out naturally, he probably would have been booted during the early jury phase of the game. But because he was able to slide by his biggest danger spot in the game and get to a final 6 that he was perfectly set up for, he does take that opportunity and ends up winning the game. But even then, he does make suboptimal moves along the way, and that really sums up his game to me. I mean, he is a player that doesn't make major mistakes within the game, but makes a lot of minor ones continuously throughout the season. and was rarely effective in what he was trying to do, but it just never caught up to him, largely due to a lot of other lucky circumstances that happened on the season, which is something that I really struggle with how much credit I should give him for the game that he played here, as again, I do think a lot of his game was just plain luck. And to go along with that, I have not properly decided on exactly where I would rank him as a winner. I mean, my first instinct is that he is around Casey. I think they are a similar caliber of player, at least. But even then, I feel like Casey was more active in getting to the position that she was in than Xavier. Mind you, I am higher on Casey's game at this point than I was during my last winner ranking. But to me, that is the position that feels right to me, is right below Casey. Even though I had more frustrations with Casey's win than Xavier, I think a lot of that is due to Casey facing off against better competition at the very end than Xavier, where again, Casey faces off against Tyler, one of the best players we have ever seen. Xavier faces off against Big D. And even if he had faced off against Azza, it's kind of the same thing. It's like, I do think Xavier's game looks better on the offset just due to the fact that he had weaker people around him towards the end of the game. But as of right now, I do feel like that is my current assessment of his game, is that, again, I think he's around the Casey level, probably right below her. So again, an X win here was the most satisfying outcome that was available by the time with the final three here, despite it not being exactly the outcome that I personally would have wanted. But with that, I mean, that is the season of BB23, which I'm still very conflicted on as a whole. I mean, it is a season with an amazing cast that seemed to be more game savvy than your standard newbie season, and was also a season that had so much potential early on. But to me, it just ends up being that, a season with potential. Like, while the Frenchie HOH was really exciting, I mean, beyond that, the next few rounds became more about players setting themselves up for down the road. And it felt like that was going to come to a head as we neared jury. And yes, we did get that Christian week, which was fun. But after that, instead of getting this battle that I wanted to see, we had the Cookout dominating from that point forward, with almost no one playing in their best interest. And at that point, it became more about, oh, we're going to see the Cookout go against each other at 6. But then that ends up happening in the worst possible way as well, with the 3 most active players in the season going out back to back to back, with Tiffany going out first being even more disappointing, leaving us with the most delusional final 3 we've ever had in the history of the show. I mean, the main positive to me from the season is the story of the Cookout. Again, the most dominant alliance in the history of the show, giving us the first ever black winner. But beyond that, I do feel like the season ends up being a massive disappointment, but it does give me hope for future seasons, where hopefully the potential that this season had is able to play out on future seasons without having players have to sacrifice their games in the name of that cause. But at the end of the day, it does affect how entertaining this season was, to where, to me, this is a bottom tier season of the show, which again sucks to say considering how great certain portions of the season were, but the number of frustrations that I have with the season do have to land it near the bottom of my season rankings. But there we go. I mean, that is my review of Big Brother 23. Now, like my other season reviews, I will be doing a Big Brother 23 player ranking in the near future, so stay tuned for that. We also got a review of the Circle US Season 3 coming soon, and obviously more Survivor and Big Brother content down the road. Obviously, I'll be back for BB24, Celebrity Big Brother, all that stuff. But for now, that's the video. Thank you for watching.